Last Thursday, at the time I'm recording this video, Ubisoft revealed the first gameplay for their newest IP, Immortals: Fenyx Rising. You might know it as the game once called Gods and Monsters, a better name that had to be changed so that Ubisoft didn't get sued by an energy drink. Terrible name aside, it only takes a few minutes of watching the gameplay to recall a particular game where the developers seem to have derived a lot of their ideas from. Breath of the Wild, the most recent in a long line of Zelda titles, was widely praised by media outlets and gamers alike for its colorful, open world full of things to see and explore. Defining features of the game included its cartoony art style and puzzle-based dungeons called shrines, which made up much of the gameplay content. Both of these concepts, among others, have seemingly been copied into this new Ubisoft title, which perhaps may never have even been developed without Breath of the Wild's massive commercial and critical success. This brings up a particular point about the industry of big-budget AAA games that is frequently criticized, but not as frequently discussed in detail. Putting it simply, unique and original game development in the majority of large game development studios has not been a priority for the past 15 years. I feel like most of that statement is relatable for gamers, but you might be wondering why I said the last 15 years versus a more recent period. As part of my research for this video, I looked at which games have been most widely chosen as the Game of the Year each year since 2000 by a variety of games media publications. I found that for the years of 2005 and 2006, the two games that were picked the most shared several commonalities with each other and many Game of the Year winners that came after them. In 2005, Resident Evil 4, a third-person shooter that was more combat-oriented than the first three Resident Evil games, was the common nomination among outlets for the best game that year. Then, in 2006, many outlets selected Gears of War, a new IP that in a similar fashion to Resident Evil 4 was a third-person, combat-oriented game. These two games mark a clear division in the data, where after 2006, third-person action games are very prevalent in the Game of the Year discussions, when in earlier years they were virtually absent. This is what it looks like if we take the one game from each year since 2005 that has garnered the most Game of the Year awards the year they were released, and line them all up. It should be noted that the majority of these games are made by AAA studios. If you have played even a few of these games, you'll begin to notice a pattern. To make it a little clearer, these are all the games that are presented both primarily from the third-person perspective and feature combat as their central gameplay loop. That's 10 of the last 15 years that the most praised Game of the Year by games media is a third-person combat game. It could be argued that since Skyrim can be played in third person, it should be thrown in, but I have rarely seen people even attempt it, so I'm going to leave it out for now. If we step one layer deeper, we can see that of these 10 games, 7 of them feature shooter combat systems as opposed to melee or magic-oriented ones. This prevalence and popularity of the third-person action game, and more specifically the third-person shooter, is one of the primary reasons for the lack of originality and innovation in the AAA game space in recent years. Another reason for the lack of originality in big-budget games is the large difference between the motivations of an indie developer and a AAA studio when they are making them. For indies, a lot of their motivations typically grow out from the fact that they are relatively financially independent when compared to AAA studios. Bigger developers are constrained by the desires of their publisher and shareholders to varying degrees from before the game is even in pre-production, directly resulting in their creative freedom being restricted. For indie devs, the publishers who they deal with usually sign on later in the development process when the game idea is fully formed, sometimes even in a testable alpha state. This process allows an indie development team to implement their ideas more quickly and effortlessly without being afraid that their financial backing will be stripped out from under them. As a result, indie teams will be able to pitch more unique graphic styles and design choices more frequently and confidently, making indie games more varied than their counterparts. On the other hand, AAA studios have one clear, primary goal from the get-go: make as much money as possible. Now, I'd like to note here that I'm not saying indies don't consider making money when making games. It's just not typically the reason why an indie developer chooses to go indie in the first place. Different budgetary situations and pure number of employees make larger studios less influenced by the ideas of individual designers, both of which serve the higher-ups and financial backers involved in the process. Many developers have left the bigger studios to create their own companies. One example is Rafael Colantonio, co-founder of Arcane, the studio behind the Dishonored series. He related AAA game development to a car factory in an interview with PC Gamer, saying, "They're set up like a car factory where, after Model 3 we have to start thinking about Model 4. Not quite the environment where you'd expect the most original games to come out of. The lack of individual expression in the AAA space is another reason why games that come from there seem to draw comparisons to other games more readily than a successful indie does." This is all to say that financial incentives lead large publishers like Electronic Arts and Ubisoft toward demanding more formulaic experiences that appeal to a wider audience. Publishers see critically and commercially successful games and tend to disregard the former in favor of the latter. "Oh, that third Witcher game sold pretty well, right? Why don't we make our Assassin's Creed games more like that?" Out comes the latest games in the series, Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, which wear their inspirations on their sleeves. "Hey, we need some new ideas for Star Wars games because we just got the license." "Well, those old Battlefront games did well, didn't they? Let's just churn out a few of those and make them more like Battlefield," which is how you get the most recent games in that series. The last 35 years of Mario and Zelda games have been bestsellers. Who cares about creating new IPs? "Hey, did you hear that new Zelda game sold pretty good? Yeah, we should make a game like that." And now you have Immortals Phoenix Rising. And just because AAA development is more focused on the money doesn't mean they forget about review scores. Besides the ads they directly pay for, review scores from mainstream games media publications like IGN and Polygon are some of the best advertising a publisher can get for a AAA game. This in and of itself is not a problem. Game reviews provide value for the consumer like any other product review, in that you get to view impressions of people that have the product before you shell out any money for yourself. The issue comes in when you start thinking about how games are scored. According to Metacritic and OpenCritic, the two largest game review congregators, the average game review score is around the mid-70s out of 100, more specifically a 74. Taken at face value, many consumers won't have a problem with this. Of course, that's the average. A 7 out of 10 has been the score for an average game for years. And I would counter with just because something is the status quo doesn't make it the best way to do things. Placing the average score at 74 creates issues for both the game consumer and the developer. For the consumer, the limitations of this average score is that reviews of good games are forced to be less nuanced than reviews of bad games, because bad games simply have more numbers to be defined by. This leads to less informed consumer decision-making when they are deciding which game they are going to buy that year, because more often than not, they are going to be buying the game considered to be above average than the one that's below. More importantly, for the developer and the thesis of this video, having the average review score be higher than the numerical average of 5 out of 10 or 50 out of 100 limits the potential feedback a developer can receive on their game and contributes to the homogenization and under-originality of AAA games. The figurative difference between a 7 and an 8 is much more dramatic than the literal one the number difference implies. A 7 is a good game that maybe it lacks ambition, is too repetitive, has a few technical bumps in the road, or is too repetitive, but you came away from it happy nonetheless. An 8, on the other hand, is a great game that leaves you with something outstanding to remember them by, usually novel gameplay ideas for single-player or multiplayer, clever characters and writing, noteworthy graphics and sound, or some combination thereof. If it seems like there's a large discrepancy between these descriptions, it's because they are IGN's official review guidelines verbatim. If games media publications utilize the 1 through 6 rankings more often on the 1 to 10 review scale, developers would be able to more clearly see what differentiates their game from others in the reviewer's eyes, and more easily improve or innovate on the parts of the game that contributed to a lower score. Over time, the increased use of more currently unused scores will serve to separate the bad games from good, like the current review system, but will add significant layers of depth between them for developers to gain useful information for future projects to separate themselves from other AAA studios. The enemies of originality in big-budget game development seem to me to be the biggest, most stagnant institutions in the industry. The prevalence of third-person action games, the restriction of developers' creativity by major publishers, and the shallowness of the current implementation of the 1 to 10 review system all prevent innovation in every aspect of AAA game development. All of these concepts have been mainstays of the industry for at least the past 15 years and show no signs of changing in the near future. There is some good news, though. The ultimate force that can motivate AAA development studios to innovate in their games is the players themselves. As cliché as it sounds, the customer is usually right in the games industry, and their dollars will be the biggest influence when big developers and publishers are making decisions regarding new games. So next time you see a $60 game that puts originality front and center, see if it's interesting to you and consider supporting a developer that took a risk.